Hi, this is Mrs. Walker here, and I'm going to be continuing the read aloud that we started in class before we took a break from meeting at our school. The last book that we were reading was The Twits by Roald Dahl, which I'm sure you remember us starting. It was such a fabulous book. The evil things that they do, the ugly people that the Twits were. Let me give you a quick recap. The Twits were in the middle of pulling lots of really mean pranks onto each other. If you remember, Mrs. Twit had a glass eye, a fake glass eye, and she loved to take her glass eye out and leave it places to freak out her husband. The last time that she did that, she put her glass eye in the bottom of his cup as he was drinking beer. He did not like that very much. So to get back at his wife, he decided to put a frog in her bed, and he made her believe that it was a really nasty creature that was going to bite her legs off, when really it was just a frog. And at some point he had to throw water on his wife because she fainted, and in the end the frog used that to happily splash around and fall asleep on her pillow while she slept downstairs. To get back at her husband, do you recall what she did? It was something to do with Mr. Twit's dinner the next night. Wormy Spaghetti? Does that ring a bell? Mrs. Twit cooked a big pot of spaghetti, but as she made her husband's plate, she mixed in some big, fat, long earthworms. And he noticed his plate was moving around, but she said, oh, it was a brand new spaghetti. Wiggly noodles or something like that. It wasn't on her plate, so she showed him that it was delicious by eating all the spaghetti on her plate, and that convinced him that it must be okay. He thought it was a little bitter, though. Told her that next time she should buy the regular spaghetti that she normally gets. And then in the end, she let the cat out of the bag and said, "You ate worms!" And boy, was he upset. So to get back at his wife for that horrible prank, Mr. Twit began messing around with her walking stick. And every night after she was asleep, he would take her stick downstairs to his workshop and add a tiny little circle piece of wood to the bottom of her stick to make it just a tiny bit longer. He did it for such a long time that eventually her stick went all the way up to almost her entire body. And she couldn't understand why her stick was getting longer. She told him, "My stick's growing." And then he told her, "Silly woman, it's a dead piece of wood. Doesn't mean your stick is growing. It must mean that you are getting smaller." And then he told her, "You have the shrinks, the dreaded shrinks." So now Mrs. Twit thinks she has this horrible disease called the shrinks, and she wants to know how to get rid of it. Let's see how that unfolds. That's where we're going to pick up today. The title of this next chapter is called Mrs. Twit Has the Shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. You can see how far off the ground her feet really are now. That's not what her chair used to look like. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with her walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit of extra wood on the bottom of the stick, he had done the same thing to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit's face went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit was still remembering about the worms in his spaghetti, and he didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" He said, "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body. Your body shrinks into your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. Terrible disease, said Mr. Twit. The worst in the world. How long have I got? Cried Mrs. Twit. How long before I finish up with a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Mr. Twit put on a very serious and solemn face. At the rate you're going, he said, shaking his head sadly, I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. Isn't there anything we can do? Cried Mrs. Twit. There's only one cure for the shrinks, said Mr. Twit. Well, tell me, she cried. Oh, tell me quickly. We'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Mrs. Twit. You won't last long if you don't, said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. What must I do? Cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. You've got to be stretched, said Mr. Twit. Stretched? How is Mr. Twit going to stretch his wife? Let me see if this picture gives you a clue. What do you notice about that picture? Let me hold it up. There you go. How is he going to stretch Mrs. Twit? Well, Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling up the balloons, and he had an iron ring into the ground. Can you see that here? He has that circle ring right there that it's stuck deep into the ground. And he has everything tied to it. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some were tied around her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrists, and some were even tied to her hair. Soon there were 50 colored balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. Can you feel them stretching you? Asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. They're stretching me like mad. He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upward by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights just to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and she said something really silly. Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground? She gasped. If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me. And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. The next chapter is called Mrs. Twit Goes Ballooning Up. There's enough pull here to take me to the moon, Mrs. Twit cried out. To take you to the moon, exclaimed Mr. Twit. What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh, dear me, no. We most certainly wouldn't, cried Mrs. Twit. Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe. Very well, my angel, said Mr. Twit, with a ghoulish grin on his lips. He knelt down at her feet, but he didn't tie extra string. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through all the strings, holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. Oh, she went up like a rocket. Help! She screamed, save me! But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below, looking up. What a beautiful sight, he said to himself. How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. What a marvelous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever. I'll give you this picture. Are any of you drawing pictures right now as I'm reading the story like we used to in class? I hope some of you are. If you're not, feel free to pause this video and grab a piece of paper so you can draw along with me. I would love to see what you're creating as we're reading through this book. Mr. Twit not Mr. Twit, because I didn't even read the title of the next chapter. The next chapter says Mrs. Twit Goes Ballooning Down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start to come down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. And as she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and less, and her rate of climbing began to slow down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether, and she just stayed still in the air. So she bit through one more string, and very slowly she began to float downward. Now, thankfully, it was a calm day, and there was no wind at all. Because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. So now she began to come absolutely straight down. How lucky that the wind hadn't blown her this way or this way as she was moving. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's dress billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. Those are her underwear. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. Now the next chapter, the title makes so much sense. It is Mr. Twit Gets a Horrid Shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grizzly old grunion! You rotten old turnip! You filthy old frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he had been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up. He gaped. He gasped. He gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth like, "Oh!" He said, "Oh! I'll get you for this," cried Mrs. Twit. She was floating right down on top of him, and she was purple with rage, slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to the whole time. "I'll swash you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll gnash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and dresses and a fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. I think he got what he deserved. I can't even imagine having that happen to me. So crazy. She would be really, really ticked off. Well, I hope you enjoyed those few chapters for today. That was the end of the Twits pulling pranks on each other. The book's now going to move on, and we're going to learn about something new in their house called the monkey cage. We haven't heard anything about a monkey cage until now, and that's going to be the focus for the rest of the story. I'll check with you tomorrow, and maybe you can listen in and see what happens in the story. Until then, bye.